Procurement and Technical Assistance Commission, Council, PTAC, that's what we call it, that's based in our office. So if you want to, after we're done, they said, please go browse around, talk to people, have some refreshments and cookies, whatever you want. But they invited everybody here to go out there if you're interested. So to get started, let's just go around the room and introduce ourselves real quick. My name's Tara Toohey with the Governor's Office of Economic Development.
John Harvey with the Utah Public Service Commission.
Bert Granberg with the Automated Geographic Reference Center.
Steve Proctor with Utah Communications Agency Network.
Joe Wabra, Enterprise Technologies.
Craig Nielsen from the State Library. I'm representing the director.
Can you turn on your mics?
Bill Harry, Salt Lake Valley Emergency Communications Center.
Kelly Cole, Governor's Office of Economic Development.
Tyler Rasmussen with Strata Networks.
Dave Ryan with Strata Networks.
Jared Anderson with Emory Telecom.
And Yoakum with UDOT.
Christy, Automated Geographic Reference Center.
Steve Porter, University of Utah.
Great. You'll notice we have a shortened agenda today. We had the governor having a meeting here in this room at noon, so we needed to get out, but now they're in a different conference room. So anyways, I think 11:30 is a good ending time, so we'll see how it goes. So we have a few announcements. Did everybody pick up a copy of the Advisory Council report? It's on the table back here. We can pass around some more copies if you didn't get one. But the report was released on June 19th, this Tuesday, and we did a press release and got a little bit of coverage. I did an interview on KSL radio. It was a live interview and it was terrifying. And I think it went good enough that we can't find it online anywhere, and I never heard it rebroadcasted. So we'll post that up on our website if we ever find it. We did get some pickup from Utah Business Magazine, Utah Pulse, Utah Policy Daily. We haven't seen a lot of news hits other than that, so just to report to everybody. Let's see, there are a few other things I wanted to mention. I asked John Harvey if he would tell us a little bit about the Public Service Commission's upcoming technical conference regarding USF. John, do you want to actually step up here so we can get it recorded? Yeah. This one's on right here. They're all on. Yeah.
Good morning. The Public Service Commission, as I think a lot of you already know, is often involved in regulating either a parent company or a sister company of many of the broadband providers in the state. But we're in this interesting legal, not gray area, but just defined space where we don't actually regulate the broadband components directly, but we end up making lots of decisions that have an effect on the broadband. And then to add, and that's sort of the state level type of regulation. And then to add to that, the FCC, as I'm sure everyone in this room is quite familiar with now, is going through a process of trying to transition what traditionally was the Universal Service Support Fund, which supported telephone service, toward a Connect America, more broadband-oriented type service. And they put a lot of different obligations on both carriers, providers, and the regulators. So what we've done in an attempt to try and get a handle on that order and the obligations it might impose on both the commission and on carriers or providers is to set a technical conference where we're basically inviting anyone, literally anyone in the world that wants to give us direction as to their interpretation of what that order requires us to do and the industry to do. And what the hope for that is that we won't miss important deadlines and cause problems either for ourselves or for the industry in general. So the technical conference is designed to begin to put together a timeline of everything that needs to be accomplished. So if there's something that's near and dear to your heart in that those FCC orders that you want to make sure that we're aware of, please either submit comments or attend the technical conference, either way.
When are those comments due?
That was in the order yesterday that
July
I
9th,
was.
July 11th.
I was in meetings nonstop all day and didn't know what went out yesterday, but July 11th would be when the comments would be done.
And I think the technical conference actually just got rescheduled to the 19th at 10 a.m.
What is a major issue?
Well, the biggest issue from the Public Service Commission's perspective, but this may not be anybody else's perspective, is that the FCC is dramatically changing the way they provide funds to the companies within the states. And we have the situation where like I say, the area that we are legally authorized to regulate is no longer going to be quite the primary area that the FCC is going to be providing support to, but it's still the same companies that we're regulating. So we would like to possibly get some direction either from legislature or someone as to how to sort of harmonize different rules. But the biggest problem is that there's going to be dramatic change in the amount of money coming. Given that Utah has done such a wonderful job, well, not Utah per se, but the carriers within Utah, the broadband providers and telephone providers, have done an excellent job of getting coverage. We potentially have a problem where we may be getting less money in the future because the perceived need won't be as high in Utah on the Fed's part. Yeah, well, and on a need-based program, that's the way it is. But there are a lot of states in the country that, when you look at their adoption rates, both for telephone service and for broadband, that are small fractions of what we have. And so if you have a federal program now that says we want to get broadband up to speed everywhere, and we're already mostly there, at least according to standards the FCC is evaluating it against, that could mean problems for our state. So that's an issue we're concerned about. But mainly we want to make sure that there's a lot of deadlines and a lot of things we have to do. We want to make sure we know what they are.
And when are those changes from the FCC going to start impacting companies in Utah?
Well, some already have. They've had to change some of the rates that they charge other providers for use of their network, particularly at the interstate level. Those tariffs are now being filed that are scaling those rates back over time, which means that those companies are getting less revenue as a result of that. But basically starting from a little while ago up through the next 2 years, there's just going to be sort of constant changes going on.
Have you guys already seen that? Do you want to turn it on?
So there's a ton of detail behind it, and no sense getting into all of it right here, but essentially USF, the main recovery mechanism for a lot of rural, at the time, telephone line build-outs has been shifted to the broadband effort, like you mentioned. Some of those changes have already started, like you said. A significant one starts in July, and that's a tariff rate raise of 50 cents to all subscribers. Over time, it'll be a few dollars in change, and that's not a huge deal. I know for our company specifically, the one that's a big impact is access revenue. For example, when I ride CenturyLink's network, I pay them access to ride their network, and vice versa. And so that's a really, really big impact. Essentially, necking access rates down to nothing and saying, bill and keep. I won't pay you to ride yours. You don't pay us to ride ours. So it's a big impact, and has the potential to definitely affect the way a lot of the rurals and CenturyLink and everybody else does business. So.
That's what I heard.
Okay, thank you. So I guess if you have more questions, you can contact John.
Indeed.
Right, John? Okay.
Or one of the rural, who probably know more than me. But after the technical conference, I'll be up to speed.
Did anybody else have discussion items they wanted to bring to the council today? I didn't really hear from anybody before the meeting, but any updates on Forest Service?
A comment back to Salt Lake City. Our canyons
What was the tenor of SOC's response?
They didn't want our cameras. They thought it was gonna affect their watershed.
It won't.
Yeah, we think we're covered. So now the Forest Service gets to decide if we've covered all our bases on the response letter. Spotted owl, we haven't run into spotted owl. You know, we have had falcons and we've had to wait for a whole nest to hatch before we could move on. But that was our own project.
Okay, well, if we don't have any other discussion items, then we'll just move on with our agenda. The first thing I wanted to mention, did everybody get the comments that were on the table? I'll just pass these around. So, as you know, NTIA issued a request for information regarding the state and local grant program for the implementation of grants regarding FirstNet and the National Public Safety Broadband Network. And so it was a month turnaround time, and I think we announced at our last month's meeting that the comments were due, and we didn't really take action on it in the meeting, but after the meeting, everything kind of came together really quick, and we formed a working group of state entities to draft comments and to file on behalf of the state of Utah. So we filed comments on the due date, which was June 15th, and what you have is the introduction that Steve Proctor wrote, and he kind of headed up this group along with Kevin Rose from DTS. And we also got a letter in support of our comments from the governor, which is attached. And so it really represented a very quick effort to get sort of what we have been doing out on paper and to get it submitted. And so it was a lot of work in about a week amount of time. Steve, do you have anything to add to the comments?
Push, it says push.
I just want to say that the cooperative effort was super. Everybody came together quick. We outlined what needed to be said very rapidly, and Tara and her staff helped us get the final document put together. And I believe we've put together a really good report to NTIA. I would encourage each of you who have a desire to go, the references on the top of the page, go see what other states, counties, cities have said. And that'll kind of give you a barometer of where this effort's going. FirstNet has to stand up its board by August the 22nd, so they're on a real short leash to take these comments, to put them together and determine which direction they're going to go, and then the timelines and the legislation really put some quick triggers on what's got to happen going forward. So it's going to be a process, to say the least.
So there were 27 states who filed comments. Most of the states involved some sort of broadband working group because there was a question included in the comments that asked specifically about state broadband initiatives, and that is the Utah Broadband Project, which this council is an entity of, I guess. And so it was good from my perspective to see more of the mapping integrated into this, because I think that's going to be a big component going forward. So I would encourage you to go to the website, read what other states said, read what we said, and if you would like to, have input to the working group as we go forward, we're probably going to keep that working group alive as more public comment requests come out, and as FirstNet moves forward. Any thoughts, comments? Okay. No? Okay, great. We're just moving right along here. Okay, so our next agenda item is to talk about the executive order from President Obama and also the announcement of the U.S. Ignite initiative. Did everybody pick up a copy of the order? I'll pass it. So just to summarize the executive order before we move on to Steve's presentation about US Ignite. Oh, Steve, get the.
I bet it
You
will
can
work.
probably do it, but.
Yeah, I don't want to break any state property though.
So just to summarize what this executive order says, it creates a broadband deployment on federal property working group. This working group is going to be co-chaired by the Administrator of General Services and the Secretary of Homeland Security designee. They will consult with the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy and coordinate with the Chief Performance Officer. They'll have representatives from the Departments of Defense, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Transportation, Veterans Affairs, the U.S. Postal Service, the FCC, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, National Security Staff, and then other representatives as appropriate. The mission of this working group is to ensure a coordinated and consistent approach to implementing agency procedures, requirements, and policies related to federal lands, buildings, rights-of-way, federally assisted highways, tribal lands to advance broadband deployment. So within a year, the working group has to come out with certain guidelines in respect to several sections of the executive order. Also included in the executive order was a dig once suggestion that UDOT actually had a lot of input on. Lynn, did you want to speak to that?
It was a lot of fun when it came through. It was pretty heavy-handed when it came through. And UDOT paired back to say, let's go back to what we've been doing in Utah. Let's go for best practices. Let's not go for a heavy-handed mandate. We'll do this. Let's go for best practices, show the cooperation that we've been doing with the telecom companies and how it's been successful for us. Mandates, we were afraid it would tie our hands and not allow us to trade as easily as we have. We're able to trade pretty easy without any federal restraints on us right now. We were afraid that was going to make some restraints on the ability to negotiate. So we suggested back that we do best practices and that we help and that we have a cooperative atmosphere, and that's what they ended up putting in. So we go to the one line and we go, oh, that's our language. So if you go to transportation and you look at the best practices, that's what UDOT contributed back into the section.
And how long have you guys been working on this?
They came to us in, what was it, January? It was fun.
Also, the bill that we talked about in this committee, Representative Eshu's dig once policy, her office came out with a big statement, and they were pleased with the order and the language in the order. So
maybe maybe she's listening to encouraging and not heavy-handed.
Yeah.
Oh.
So the other part of that announcement was the announcement of the US Ignite initiative. So Steve has been heavily involved in this and is going to give us a presentation about what that can mean for us.
Yeah, and there are obviously a lot of people in the room that know stuff about US Ignite. Dennis Sampson, our friends from Utopia. Let me say a little bit here. I was able to borrow some slides from Glenn Reichard, and I'll mention Glenn in a moment. But the idea here is really to try to stimulate the broadband development environment. And if you've been around the internet long enough, you know that there's essentially an ecosystem relationship between applications and underlying infrastructure. And there's a sense right now that the set of compelling applications for driving broadband investments are not there yet. And so this is both a public and a private partnership to really sort of break the logjam. We know from looking at international statistics, we're down in terms of our level of what we might call real broadband penetration. And this is now a national competitiveness issue, and potentially even national security. So in this model it essentially takes a village here. You've got government, industry, both carriers and tech companies, private foundations, higher ed, and a project called Genie, and we're going to mention Genie a little bit. This is both a federal initiative coming out primarily from the National Science Foundation right now, but I believe 6 other agencies are involved. And they've also stood up a 501c3 nonprofit with the US Ignite tag. So they've got 7 agencies counting NSF. They have 9 companies lined up as members, 26 communities and foundations lined up, and that includes both UEN and Utopia, as well as a project up in southeastern Idaho, town of Ammon, and 10 network partners. So within this space, there are actually 2 cooperative ventures. US Ignite is really focusing on the applications that help develop or help motivate broadband deployment. There is a separate nonprofit known as GigU, where about 25 universities, primarily in college towns, have gotten together and they realized that one of their critical economic differentiators is broadband, real broadband connectivity in their community. So the places like Madison, Wisconsin, Fort Collins, Colorado, and this group, it's likewise a nonprofit. They issued an RFI last year. They're trying to stimulate corporate higher ed partnerships for getting broadband built in their community. If you look at cities like Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is a bright spot in the state of Michigan compared to what's happened in the rest of the state, there's a lot of development around the University of Michigan, and they push broadband very hard in that community. University of Utah, Utah State BYU are not a member of GigU yet. We have looked at it. We decided to pass due to, frankly, other projects. But we see a lot of interest, and we expect that most of higher ed will get involved in this activity. So the idea is really to put higher ed back in a contributing role. I think in Utah we've been there throughout, but in many states higher ed has drifted away, and it helps get us past the broadband bottleneck that we have right now. So in this model, US Ignite is seeking compelling applications, and I think, as we all know, the application consists of a little more than software code. US Ignite is trying to align around national priorities, smart grids, energy conservation, healthcare, making healthcare more accessible and economic, trying to partner with universities. In part, universities have been using new technologies in the internet space over the last few years. I'll mention that in a moment. They're also deploying advanced infrastructure. We have an award from the National Science Foundation to work with Genie, or to work with UEN to put this technology into UEN. Usually some type of startup money, either federal funding or from a foundation. Ability to work with industrial partners, and then in the case of many of these communities, working with a community organizer to help get this project off the ground. A good example here is Lev Gonick, who's the Chief Information Officer at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. Cleveland is a pretty economically challenged environment right now, and it has some pretty profound social challenges, including 1/3 of women who have type 2 diabetes, adult women. So it's a city with serious social and economic issues, and Case Western is really trying to save the city that surrounds what's actually a pretty elite research university. So there's a lot of motivation right now in this space for activity. Looking at it technically, Ignite is embracing a concept known as software-defined networking, which is essentially the ability to use what we might call off-board software to control routers and switches. There's a technology known as OpenFlow that was initially developed at Stanford, that now many of the startups in Silicon Valley are beginning to look at. This has become a pretty hot topic in Silicon Valley, and I think, quite frankly, the venture capitalists view this as a fundamental threat to Cisco's business plan, essentially by producing lower cost network hardware that can run an open source, controlled by open source software, is certainly a threat to the large-scale networking companies right now. If you've read The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, this is just out of that book. There are racks that are being deployed now with this technology. UEN is putting those in. And the other technical driver here is the realization, what we primarily have up the U for our faculty, staff, and students, is that's essentially should be the broadband target. Get gigabit to the end user, enable high-definition apps, set that bar there, really establish a new standard for broadband. So the idea here is to really try to create an environment where people bring their best ideas, and again, tied to national priorities, transforming health, getting HD video out there cost effectively, enabling new startups, and also improving transportation. So Glenn is obviously seeking people to join US Ignite, but there's, I think, some interesting capabilities here or considerations. The idea of future-proofing our networks by making sure that when we do RFPs and RFIs that we ask for open flow compliance. Certainly, this is a technology that I think is in our interest because it can lower the ultimate cost of both the initial CapEx as well as the OpEx for the network. Looking at putting in Genie racks that help expand open flow capability. And the other thing is we really want to encourage application development. And I'll say a little bit more about this. The Mozilla Foundation, which is a nonprofit open source software development group, they produce Thunderbird as well as the open source browser, Firefox. They're getting involved here as well. So there was an announcement last week at the White House, last Thursday, and I think there were 4 things that were really announced. The first of which is that the National Science Foundation has had a project called Genie, which stands for the Generalized Environment for Network Innovation. And this has been a project primarily of network researchers. Georgia Tech, Princeton, Stanford, and I'm very pleased to say the University of Utah in a very lead role. And the idea here is to create a test bed on a national scale where next generation internet protocols and applications can be tested. There's essentially a success catastrophe in the internet now. It's very difficult to experiment on next generation protocols. And an example of that is IPv6. The IPv6 standard was developed 19 years ago this summer, and there was a recognized need that the IPv4 address space was limited. It's taken 19 years to get to. We're just now approaching the tipping point on getting IPv6 deployed. So change is hard once you have a production network, as you well know. So the idea with Genie is to create a test bed and then to have a way, such as through this group, to get those applications and technologies out into the commercial environment. The National Science Foundation, through a division called SCIES, which is really the Computer Science and Engineering section of NSF, is providing financial support for some initial projects. NSF has an acronym EAGER for small-scale projects that project managers can award. They've also done a solicitation through a Dear Colleague letter seeking to fund additional projects. Mozilla is announcing a contest for innovative applications in this space. There's $500,000 of funding available. And this new nonprofit organization is now up and running, US Ignite. So that's what really was announced last week. Now where does Utah play? And I think we've got some really good stories here. The first is US Ignite's Chief Technical Officer lives in the Upper Avenues, and that's Glenn Reichard. Glenn is a longtime internet entrepreneur. He helped start one of the first regional networks for higher ed, Suranet, in the mid-1980s when he was CIO at the University of Maryland. He came out here to be the CTO for Novell when Eric Schmidt was the CEO, and he also was the CEO of a national higher ed network known as NLR. So Glenn's here, and while he has a national role, he's communicating with us, and I think I can say that this isn't being webcast, right? I think he's looking out for you, Tom. Okay. I think I don't think he'd object to that. The second thing, and I think this is really strong, the University of Utah is playing a very strong leadership role in the development of this NSF Genie testbed. And if you knew the name Jay LaPro, Jay was a longtime faculty member at the U who passed away 3 years ago. He had some very fundamental ideas about 10 years ago that were really adopted by Genie about 5 years ago. So Jay really broke the ground. Rob Ricci, who's a young faculty member in the School of Computing, has taken these over. He actually represented the U at the White House last week. So we've got a key spot there. Rob is the co-chair of the Genie Architecture Committee. And so this is really a strategic positioning for Utah. And we have 2 entities in the state that have won BTOP awards. These are our NTI awards that will be closely tied to US Ignite initiatives. And of course, Utopia has won one, and UEN won another. So for a small state that represents 1% of the U.S. population, I think we're pretty well positioned here. And also, our population is relatively compact, not ignoring the rural component here. But I think we can think about some breakaway moves. Let me just say a little bit more about what's going on at the U in terms of network research. This is really fundamental research, and the idea here is to be able to do reproducible experiments over the network. If you're using your internet connection at home and you try to do a reproducible download of files from Google or a cloud provider, you'll likely get different results. But when you're trying to engineer things, as the carriers in here know well, you really need to have a standard reproducible environment so you can tweak things and know that the ground is not changing out from underneath you. The technology that's been developed at the U, Emulab Protogenie, allows both researchers and network engineers to do experiments over a shared infrastructure, but do those experiments in a reproducible way. And so there's a large cluster now up at the U that's dedicated to this. Other universities around the country and also globally have built out similar clusters, and they've federated these resources to create a very large test bed. There's experimentation here both in the programmable radio and the wireless space, as well as the switched Ethernet space. So it's a great kudo for Utah, and it was essentially our step inside the front door for US Ignite. Even with the 2 BTOP awards, I don't think we'd be as well positioned right now if we didn't have this network research capability. So here are a couple websites on the NSF Computer Science Directorate webpage. They've got information. US Ignite has a lot of information up now, and the GigU nonprofit that's focused on broadband development in college towns also has information. The RFI and some of the summaries of the responses are probably interesting to many in this room. So with that, I'd be glad to take any questions. I think the main theme here is this is a startup initiative. I think I saw something 16 years ago at the same point in the Clinton-Gore administration when the Next Generation Internet Project was announced, which stimulated a lot of network activity among the federal research and development agencies, NSF, Department of Energy, National Institutes of Health. And there was a similar activity known as Internet 2 that started up around the same time with a nonprofit within the higher ed community. So in one sense, we've seen this movie before, but I think, and it had positive results. Many of the same players are involved again, and I think something as Utah, we're well positioned here. We're thrilled, particularly that Utopia is involved, because it provides a clear way to bring in communities and end users in a very demonstrable way. UEN connects community anchor institutions, so we can demonstrate success in the education and the research space. But I think this is a pretty good story for Utah. Any questions or comments?
The network for anybody who desires to use it.
Right now, there's really not a US Ignite network per se. We can connect to various capabilities. There's strong interest right now in public safety, and if we were to think of trials, we could bring it on to Internet 2 right now and use Genie technology to essentially enable the application. So it's public safety, disaster response, smart grid. If you look at sort of the list of national priorities, anything tied to this, is viewed as it tends to be viewed more favorably as a beneficial application. Economic development in rural areas is also and trying to crack the nut on getting this technology deployed in rural areas. There's also interest in WiMAX research too. There are within Genie there are multiple groups that have been working with WiMAX technology. University of Colorado has done a very extensive WiMAX deployment on their campus, and there's an openness in this environment to whether it's going to be a wired or a wireless solution. But it's really trying to enable experiments and innovation in the application space.
Steve, I had a question.
Sure.
Could you speak a little more to the rural component? I mean, you mentioned that you're looking at ways this could be replicated in rural areas, right, for economic development purposes, but I honestly, I don't see the connection. I mean, this seems like sort of an urban project.
Well, certainly Gig U is, because it's trying to, it's identifying those college towns. And if you look at the list of Gig U cities, they're all relatively mid-sized college towns, with the exception of Cleveland, which is in because Case Western is very, very active in this space. But a lot of these college towns are in rural locations. You can think of Logan, Utah. You can think of Blacksburg, Virginia, which are places that are off the beaten path. They have not had fiber connectivity. So I was just at Virginia Tech last week for a meeting. They have been fighting for 20 years to ensure they had fiber connectivity back in the DC area. So I think part of this may be strategies that the land-grant universities have had to adopt to ensure that they remain research competitive. That those may be strategies that smaller towns and communities can adopt as they work to make sure that they maintain their economic competitiveness and the incentives for especially for young populations to stay.
Have you had interest from USU, for example?
Yeah, we're working with USU really closely. We have with Lynn's help, we've been working with Syringa on getting dark fiber that will be coming up this summer. And from putting on my research hat, it is, and as the 3 research universities in Utah are working more closely now, it is extremely important for this kind of connectivity to get to Utah State. If we're trying to maintain, a technically viable partner as a research university, this is with Job 1 there. I presented on this to their president about a year and a half ago. He got it within about 15 seconds and said, let's do this. So bringing the Y along, bringing USU along, but I think the thing about these higher ed initiatives, we're always glad to talk about what we do, just as Lynn is. We'll operate in an open and transparent and really non-competitive environment. And I think when you think about the economic development activities in these smaller towns, it's not that different from a research university. It's pipes and bits right now.
Comment, Todd?
Yeah.
Right. I think Steve's right. I think the problem we face in the nation, how you get the applications when the network is right for the application. I think what we're doing at Utopia is we're trying to create unbox for all these smart guys like Steve. You know, really important to us that we create. The problem is that if you had an addressable market that was in the millions rather than 5,000 here and for smart marketeers, do smart things and drive to innovate money. That's my overall objective and goal with this project. Is to get like-minded organization. Junction with all the smart guys are doing, talk about how we might actually connect with those ponds to make.
Yeah, Todd, I think, if I think about what the U and Dennis and colleagues at UAN have been doing, we've been, with the help of UTA and UDOT and commercial carriers, have been building a metro ring, in addition to the links up to Logan and Provo for research. But we now have a presence in downtown Salt Lake, whether it's the Kearns building or our data center or other locations. But we're definitely interested in peer internet. I think that's, when you get into a new application environment, that's something I think is really critical, is that you're not inhibited by low-speed interconnects.
The other problem with not just problem we have aggregate.
Right.
I have a sense, I just have a question, I don't know the answer, so.
Okay.
Do you have a sense from the national level how much private investment is being driven into Ignite right now? And 'cause I think that's going to be pretty critical in terms of as this kind of gains steam.
I don't have a number here, but I've seen these initiatives start up, and they've got the right people at the table. I think AT&T, Verizon, Cisco, Juniper were all at the kickoff event. I think this contest is an interesting idea. Apparently, the law has been changed that the federal government can fund these types of innovation contests where they give out monetary awards to the best applications. I think we're seeing various ways of trying to stimulate the activity in application development. So there'll be direct federal grants through National Science Foundation. There'll be the potential for corporate partnership, and there'll be contests that are run through Mozilla. And I presume there'll be target-specific applications, maybe contests eventually in healthcare. You could see smart grid. You could see energy efficient, higher safety transportation. Things like that. So it's something that the real test will be where they are in 2 years. But the nice thing is I think they've got people that have done this before, not only in the federal government but people like Glenn and the nonprofit.
Right, the political change, if there is one.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in the frankness of this room, I think it will. I follow Intrade, and the odds are essentially 5-4 right now of a second Obama administration. But I realize that those change day by day. That one of the motivations for getting this nonprofit group stood up as quickly as possible would be if there is a change and it is not broadband friendly, that there would be a vehicle to continue to do this. I would hope if there's a change that this would be viewed as a national competitiveness issue, because it really, and quite frankly, when the party change occurred in 2001, a lot of the steam behind broadband or, advanced networking initiatives went away because it was tied, quite frankly, to Vice President Gore. This is not a political issue. This is really national competitiveness now. Yeah. Right. I mean, this is, you always, when you have a project announced in this type of campaign year, you always have to worry about that. But I think as a community, if the White House flips and we lose momentum here, we'll be another 4 or 8 years behind, and that would not be a good story. Independent of politics, just about broadband, getting us competitive with our, with other countries around the world, keeping us out front.
Thank you.
Hey, that's great.
That was great. And we'll go ahead, maybe you could save that on the computer and we'll post that on our website.
Save it to the desktop and all.
Pardon?
Just save it to the desktop and all.
Okay, so for our map of the month, this month, Christy Heaton at AGRC put together maps focusing on wireless broadband availability in our national parks. So I thought it was a really interesting way to look at broadband availability, and we've actually had a lot of interest from our tourism office about how they can use this and share the story. What's the best park to go to if you need to use your phone while you're traveling, something like that. But Christy's going to go ahead and show us some of those maps and talk us through.
So, the Utah map of the month for June national parks. Utah has 5 national parks: Arches, Bryce, Canyonlands, Capitol Reef, and Zion. Why we chose national parks? It's summer. We're in the mood to be outside. We're all in the mood to learn about national parks. And they draw in visitors from all over the world. If you've been there, you've heard all kinds of other languages spoken. They're also kind of broadband interesting because they lie on the periphery of a lot of wireless coverage areas. So interesting to know if they're covered for safety and rescue issues. And then visitor centers can be considered community anchor institutions, so they should be connected, and also to verify provider submitted data. So you'll see when I show you the maps in the next slide what we're going to see, but the drive test data is from about a year ago, July 2011, whereas the provider submitted data is the most recent from a few months ago, so there's some discrepancies there, just so you know. And then the drive test points are colored by speed, and the brighter red colors are hotter colors are faster speeds. The provider submitted data is in blue, and then you can see the campgrounds and visitor centers are marked so you can see if they're covered. So we'll start with Arches. Is the best covered. As you can see, it's pretty well covered, and then our drive test has drove the main road. Covered pretty well.
So Christy, it's kind of hard to see all of the colors, so could you just talk us through a little bit about point to covered and uncovered places? Maybe?
Sure. So gray kind of corresponds to a speed that was picked up, but that is below broadband. So
mouse there. Oh yeah, it's showing that.
Okay. Okay, so like the orange and red colors are better speeds, higher speeds. And we also have a little T-Mobile for Arches. Bryce Canyon. Our drive testers didn't drive the main road, but you can see it's a little spottier.
How is coverage gained off the road? How do you do that?
Oh, our drive test was we hired a couple guys from Massachusetts to drive the roads we selected in Utah, and they had a smartphone on the roof of their car from the main 5 wireless providers in Utah, and they collected data through a computer system, upload and download cycles. And these speeds are all speeds collected, upload, download, and
But for the off-road sites, say, deep into the main.
we don't have data for that area.
So the data that you see, so the red roads are where they drove and didn't get any signal at all. And then sort of the bolder colors are the point where we were sending and receiving.
The black roads are roads that weren't tested, but they're there for reference.
So the test points were taken as the vehicle was moving.
Right.
Represents real experience.
From a year ago.
And I think what you're referencing is when you see a coverage map that Verizon provides, obviously it shows coverage in areas that aren't driven, and so they use propagation characteristics of the wireless spectrum, and they try and estimate. So,
Of course, take into account the topography. And is all of this on existing sites and towers? And have the parks allowed the construction of new towers to improve the coverage?
Good question.
It's another question.
This is all just done with our Utah's available data resources, the broadband data, and our drive test data.
Okay. So it's done with what was already there.
Yep. Capitol Reef is the least covered, looks like. It's a pretty remote area, hard to get to. It's kind of understandable why it's not as well covered, but the visitor center, you can see it's marked with a little building symbol, is covered by AT&T. And the last one is Zion. So we concluded that you maybe shouldn't expect to get too much service in these national parks outside of the visitor center. And when we did our verification with the drive test data, it did align pretty well with what the providers submitted us, but there are some areas that it looks like the providers might have underestimated or overestimated, but in general it lines up pretty well. And a blog post is coming out later today. It'll be on the Broadband website, and you'll be able to get more information, download all these maps.
That'll be out on your blog today.
Yeah, later today, this afternoon.
And I'll include we'll have PDFs of everything so you can look.
One of the challenges in making these maps is that there's a tremendous amount of data that was collected. Well, just the uploads and downloads done is fine to show all the data points on these maps that show large areas. So, you know, it's hard to make the visuals work on the screen, but on the PDFs that will be via the blog, what was driven and how that compares to the results from the drive test compared to what the providers reported. And there is really good agreement, I think, radical, and the scale at which they do the propagation models doesn't jive perfectly with what you experience on the field, but it's really close. And I think the most interesting thing is just as much underreporting. Also interesting to see how data, how the upload performs versus the download, and that's not shown on these maps, but there are areas where the upload speeds are fantastically faster than the download speeds, and that's just an interesting thing. And we did share this data with all of the providers so that they could take it back to their network engineering. Use it however they wanted to. About a month after we received the, they've all had access to it. Likely that they're going to have the funding and the resources to go drive test the entire state. So we figured out and hopefully get as much value from that information as.
Their technology is changing all the time, so they would have to do repeated drive tests.
Pretty dynamic.
Yeah.
Landscape is.
Desire to improve coverage, parks, for that.
To use this information.
Has there been any reaction from any of the individual superintendents or the regional NPS office?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They probably have a sense for it, right? I mean, they probably have their own mobile devices and folks and have this experience.
They,
the first time that we've actually pushed this for their.
I'm thinking of the people that have the rangers, the rescue rangers that use the phrase death by GPS. And it might be it'd be interesting to talk to them about whether they consider this a feature or a bug.
Well, as long as you can make one of your towers look like one of those doo-doos. Maybe they'll let you build something in there.
I know Zion's turned down the opportunity to fiber when they were at the tunnel section. They were redoing that section, and they're constantly calling us for connectivity. And I said, so it came up, and I said, hey, you guys are right here. This is a good opportunity. Opted not to. I don't know when that road, another 50 years before that road's done. But we couldn't do anything with Department of Transportation because it's a parks road.
Well, we built a site right to the Rockville, which is the mouth of Zion's Canyon, so we have coverage right up and through part of the park.
Right. But
they don't want to take advantage of it. They got idea a better system.
Well, they really don't.
Well, that's what they tell you. Until you got to have Wi-Fi go in there, and then it's beg forgiveness rather than give permission.
Well, it was really short-sighted on their part. They just didn't want. It wasn't even going to affect the view or anything. They would have been able to connect from station to station across the park. So chose not to.
So the idea of visitor centers being community anchor institutions, is that in part of the data model that visitor centers are considered CAIs?
We didn't read that, but we
makes
just
sense.
decided,
Yeah.
we just were thinking about it and decided that, I mean, it kind of makes sense because a lot of people come in through these areas, and that's the main building in the general vicinity where you're going to have people coming through for information, and so.
I think this calls for a road trip to go test some broadband at national parks, right?
Yeah, I'd say that they're especially community anchor institutions when it's raining.
Well, thank you for putting that together. I think that's interesting. And like Christy said, we'll get that blog post up today, and so you can view it and share it. And I think tourism's excited to see it too. Lee Vonderesch was really excited. So are there any more items that we need to talk about? If not, I just had one more thing to mention. I got my invite today to the Tri-State Telecom Conference, and so those dates are July 31st through August 2nd in Jackson Hole. So if you want more information, you can probably talk to URTA. It's Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. Okay. I did want to point out on your agenda, you'll see our next meeting is on July 18th, and that is a Wednesday, because the 19th, there are 3 concurrent meetings running at the same time. There was this meeting, there is a meeting of the State Interoperability Executive Committee that was also at 10 a.m., and now the Public Service Commission's Technical Conference on USF was also at 10 a.m. So we thought we'd do everybody a favor and just move ours to Wednesday, and it doesn't conflict with the normal legislative interim meetings on Wednesdays because there are no meetings in July. So it's at 10 o'clock Wednesday the 18th in this room. So we hope you all can join us. Thank you for coming.